Anneliese Michel was born on September 21st, 1952, to a fairly normal Bavarian family in West Germany. The Michels were devoutly Catholic, but that wasn't all that surprising considering 70% of the almost 11 million residents were Catholic at the time. Anneliese's family was religious, yes, but they were more than that. They were true believers living by a strict religious code. Anneliese and her 3 sisters were forced to go to Catholic Mass twice a week. Her mother, in particular, pushed the girls to pray and devote as much time as possible to religious devotion. In many ways, Anneliese's childhood was taken from her. Because of her devout Catholic upbringing, she was denied so many of the experiences normal kids have. According to the doctor Anneliese met with later, she developed neuroses related to religious iconography as a result of punishments that were inflicted upon her as a young girl. Remember this diagnosis because it will come into play later. As religiously oppressive as the Michel house was, Anneliese's friends said she was a great student, showed strength in language study, and was publicly happy and playful. In her private life, though, Anneliese carried darkness inside her, a festering wound poisoned by the religious torment she was suffering. The emotional ramifications of the Michel family dynamic would come back to haunt them all for years. Whether it was demonic possession or mental illness, Anneliese's condition progressed gradually and worsened incrementally over a period of years. While at school one day in 1968, a then 16-year-old Anneliese unexpectedly blacked out for a few minutes. During this first documented blackout, her classmates said she fell into a trance-like state. Anneliese said she didn't remember the event and claimed she was fine after the episode. But that same night, she woke up suddenly feeling a presence pressing heavily down on her body and then wet her bed. Fearing there might be something seriously wrong with their daughter, Anneliese's parents kept her home the following day, but there were no further incidents. It seemed like it was a one-off occurrence. Anneliese said she felt fine, and she was, until August 1968, when Anneliese experienced a similar episode and was taken to a local hospital for examination and observation. Her primary care physician, Dr. Inaudible, referred her to a neurologist, Dr. Siegfried Luthi. After an examination and a series of tests, Dr. Luthi found nothing wrong with her brain function. Physically, Anneliese seemed completely healthy, but in February of 1970, Anneliese experienced the third event. After catching tuberculosis and spending months in a hospital, Anneliese suffered yet another blackout and another bedwetting episode. She became the laughingstock of the hospital ward she was staying in. The other patients mocked her for wetting the bed and blacking out. No one wanted to have anything to do with her. But that wasn't the worst of it. This third blackout was different from the others. After coming to, Anneliese reported seeing colors, hearing sounds, and feeling euphoric while praying with her rosary beads. She underwent more tests with a second neurologist, a Dr. von Haller, who diagnosed her with epilepsy and prescribed her medication. And that's when things went from bad to worse. Anneliese eventually returned to school later in 1970, but now she was a completely different person. Her friends said she was depressed and withdrawn and seemed to have a darkness about her. People started to talk about her behind her back. No, it was her seizures, which began occurring with increasing frequency. Her doctors were unable to offer any insight into the root cause of her seizures, which only compounded her family's frustration with the situation. Anneliese pressed on, though. She turned to religion as a coping mechanism. She threw herself into researching Catholicism while finishing up high school, and in 1973, she enrolled at the University of Würzburg to become a teacher. She continued to take her medication during this time, but her condition steadily declined. By mid-1973, Anneliese experienced hallucinations while praying and believed she was damned. She became obsessed with the idea that the devil was inside of her. She prayed and prayed and prayed. She would cry herself to sleep at night, clutching her rosary beads. To rid herself of what she perceived as a demon, Anneliese would add regular visits to a priest along with her standard doctor visits. By late 1973, Anneliese's strange behavior became completely unpredictable. She was evidently being driven crazy by whatever darkness had taken hold of her. To make things even worse, her erratic and unpredictable symptoms kicked into overdrive. Finally, her parents had to confront her. They informed her that they had no other choice but to pull her out of college. From that point on, she was confined to her bedroom under a literal house arrest. It was during this time she started taking Tegretol, an anti-seizure drug, and mood stabilizer. Also during this period, Annalisa reported hearing a strange knocking in her bedroom. Her sisters confirmed that they heard the knocking as well. She also claimed to hear a voice that would regularly damn her to hell. Despite dutifully taking her daily cocktail of neuroleptic medications, Annalisa's symptoms worsened in a terrifying and unexplainable way. She started growling like an animal. She saw demons. She exhibited Hulk-like strength. During one episode, Annalisa began throwing her sister around the house like a rag doll. At one point, after arguing with her parents, she urinated on the floor, then got down on all fours and lapped it up like a dog. She would regularly chew coal, rip her clothes off, and eat insects she found around the house. She was angry, irrational, and almost completely unreachable by her family members. To make things even more frightening, religious objects like crucifixes and holy water drove her mad. Her mother recalled an incident where she caught Annalisa staring at a framed portrait of the Virgin Mary, and that her daughter's eyeballs were 100% jet black. The Michel family began to realize they might be seeing the symptoms of what the Catholic Church might consider a demonic possession. Annalisa's family eventually asked several local priests for an exorcism, but the men declined and encouraged Michael to continue with the traditional medical treatment she was already receiving. Despite what you see in the movies, it isn't that easy to get an exorcism. A Catholic exorcism requires the permission of a bishop, which the Michel family could not seem to arrange. Sometime in 1973, Michaels met Father Ernst Alt, a local priest who, upon meeting Annalisa, almost immediately said she didn't look like an epileptic and claimed she wasn't suffering from seizures. Father Alt was convinced Annalise was possessed by demons and was able to get the attention of the local bishop about what was happening to Annalise and her family. Archbishop Joseph Stangl eventually granted Father Arnold Rentz's permission to exorcise Annalisa in compliance with the Ritual Romanum of 1614, but with a very important caveat. The exorcism was to be performed in complete secrecy. Father Renz performed Annalisa's first exorcism with Father Alt assisting on September 24, 1975. During the rite, she reportedly began talking about dying to atone for the wayward youth of the day and the apostate priests of the modern church. Eventually, she stopped eating, saying she was no longer allowed to. At this point, Annalisa's parents had given up consulting doctors and cut off her medication. Instead, they put all their faith in the Catholic rites of exorcism, and Annalisa was subjected to 67 exorcisms in all, over an 11-month span during 1975 and 1976. It wasn't unusual for Annalisa to endure 2 sessions a week, with some exorcism sessions lasting up to 4 hours. In audio recordings from these sessions, one can clearly hear Annalisa's distorted, guttural voice. She growls like a wild beast and makes profane utterances in response to the religious ritual. The gruesome audio recordings during her exorcisms also reveal that Fathers Renz and Alt talked to 6 spirits allegedly possessing Annalisa. These spirits, or personalities if that's what they were, made up a murderer's row of evil incarnate: Lucifer, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Cain, Hitler, and Valentine Fleischmann, a disgraced Frankish priest from the 16th century. Given Annalisa's history with religion and her obsession with Christian teachings, there were later theories that Annalisa chose these figures intentionally. It's almost impossible not to agree. Despite being not much more than skin and bones, Annalisa had to be physically restrained and held down while her exorcisms took place. This abuse, along with the lack of medical treatment and food or water, took a toll on her body. Annalisa Michel died at her home on July 1, 1976. Her death certificate stated that Annalisa ultimately died of malnutrition and dehydration. Her autopsy, however, revealed broken teeth, blackened eyes, and bruises on her hands, arms, and wrists. She also had broken knees and numerous other wounds on her body. Fathers Alt and Renz, as well as Annalisa's parents, were put on trial for negligent homicide in 1978. During the trial, the priests boldly maintained the exorcisms were successful and had liberated Annalisa from the demons possessing her. Father Alt even insisted that some of the wounds documented by Annalisa's autopsy were the stigmata corresponding to the divine wounds suffered by Jesus Christ as a result of his crucifixion. The evidence apparently didn't line up, and the story of Annalisa's alleged demonic possession wasn't enough to sway the German court's three-judge panel. All of the defendants in the case were found guilty, but their sentences varied. Fathers Alt and Renz were charged with manslaughter and given 6 months in prison with suspended sentences. Annalisa's parents received no punishment at all, as the German legal system deemed that they had experienced enough suffering. In 2005, a loose film adaptation of the story was produced, titled The Exorcism of Emily Rose. The film follows an agnostic lawyer who's tasked with defending a parish priest, who is accused of negligent homicide due to an exorcism he carried out. The screenplay for the film was written by Scott Derrickson and Paul Harris Boardman. Derrickson views himself as a believer and Boardman as a skeptic, and thought that their contrasting views would make the screenplay more dynamic. Ultimately, while the film is loosely based on the life of Annalisa Michel, it takes a vast creative license with the story. Around the same time, Hans Christian Schmid also produced a German adaptation of the story titled Requiem. The German film is a bit more faithful to the real-life events, but it too takes quite a bit of creative license. Requiem tells the story of Michaela, a woman who is struggling to lead a normal life. She's trapped in a limbo, which, depending on the viewer's perspective, could be a demonic possession or a form of mental illness. Both versions of these stories hold certain similarities with Annalisa's trials and tribulations, but they also each diverge greatly. Ultimately, the story of Annalisa Michel is a horrifyingly simple tale. In the end, we'll never truly have the answers. All we can say for sure is that Annalisa endured a horrible tragedy, and the pain and trauma that she and her family endured was very real and has never quite faded away. I survived a real-life exorcism. We were mid-exorcism when they proposed rescheduling. I had no idea demons could be so amenable, thumbing through their planners to slot me in the week after next. You see, they'd sent in the B team to perform my exorcism. It wasn't going well. There were a lot of reasons they told me I needed an exorcism, but the most glaring was the fact that I kept admitting I couldn't hear the voice of God. When the movie The Exorcist debuted 50 years ago, viewers were more than terrified. Disturbing scenes depicted a 12-year-old girl violently screaming as her eyes rolled back and green vomit spewed from her mouth, her neck cracking as her head turned 360 degrees. Theaters reported moviegoers running up the aisles as they got sick, some making it to the street before vomiting, while others weren't as lucky. This week, the Exorcist franchise releases its 6th film, a direct sequel to the original, the trailer for The Exorcist. Believer is similarly hard to watch as 2 young girls with blood dripping down their faces smile and tell their parents, "God played a trick on you." Unlike characters in those films, I didn't experience any paranormal symptoms before my ceremony. Although I'd grown up in the booming evangelical movement and became a missionary after graduating high school, I had never explored the supernatural side of my faith. I believed the devil was real, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to convince me to sin. From a young age, I'd understood the unfortunate, fundamental truth that I was born evil. I learned this before I learned to read. The consequences of my fallen nature were death and eternal suffering. I needed someone to save me. We all did. By 21, I'd moved to rural Georgia to work at the headquarters of a new, popular evangelical missionary organization. They taught me how to write books, and I was tasked with helping the leader write the 10-year anniversary edition of his book on listening prayer. Filled with step-by-step instructions on how to hear the voice of God, it was required reading for all incoming missionaries. For weeks, I met with him and another leader while they walked furiously on their treadmill desks and revealed wild tales. They were watching God move in foreign countries. They were raising people from the dead. They were waking up a generation. The men told stories. I wrote them down. The Christians I worked with in Georgia were different from the ones I grew up with. Almost everyone claimed they'd seen miracles. Where was I when everyone was being healed or brought back from the dead? Maybe I was just bad luck. My first mistake was telling them I hadn't seen miracles. The next was admitting I hadn't heard God speak. They'd just finished telling me the story of raising a man from the dead in Guatemala when I'd remarked it seemed unbelievable. "I don't know what to tell you," he said to me. A minute before, the guy was laying there stone cold dead, not breathing. Then we prayed over him, and his eyes opened right up. "Don't you hear what I'm saying?" His voice got louder, right before he launched into a sermon on how there was more to life. The leader suggested that the fact I hadn't heard God's voice was a hint that something deeper was going on, perhaps a spiritual battle within me. "Could be a demon," the other man chimed in. "You should talk to Deon. He does exorcisms all the time." The idea was suggested so nonchalantly that it was as if they told me to run to the store to pick up some aspirin. I lived with 6 other girls in a small house on the lake. Our house leader had the finished basement to herself, a fine spot for an exorcism. She volunteered to sit in. 2 women walked down the carpeted staircase, and we scattered ourselves across worn, hand-me-down couches in a semicircle. I folded my legs under myself and forced a slight smile. The women introduced themselves and apologized that Dion had been called into an emergency, so his wife and assistant were filling in. They told me not to worry and assured me they'd done plenty of these without him before. They went on to tell me they were here to help set me free. "Let's start by praying together," the assistant said as she bowed her head. The room was still lit by the overhead light. There were no flickering candles or music playing softly in the background, like I'd imagined there might be at such an event. I closed my eyes and went along. "Okay," the self-professed exorcist instructed, "I need you to repeat after me. Jesus, I repent for any sin I committed against you. Please cleanse me of my sins. Through the blood of Jesus, I claim salvation and am pure." The woman shook a few drops of oil on her thumb that she said was from the Holy Land and drew a cross on my forehead. "I anoint you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." She assured me I was doing great before announcing they were going to start talking to the demon. "Sorry, what do you mean?" I replied. She stared into my eyes. "Demon, tell us your name." I stayed silent, staring back at her. She repeated, "Demon, tell us your name. In the name of Jesus Christ, I demand you tell me your name." I let her command settle into the air around me. Was something really going to start answering her? Was I? I asked her if I should be hearing something. "Do you hear a name?" I did not. The only thing I heard in my head was my own thoughts, which I normally considered a good thing. Still, the woman stared straight at me, calling me a demon and asking for my name. I weighed my options, pretend or leave. The problem with leaving was that I had nowhere else to go. These people, for better or worse, had become my community. I wanted somewhere to belong, and they gave me that. To pretend was to survive. "Can you ask again?" I was buying time to think of something. The only demon name I remembered from the Bible was Legion, and I knew that meant something like 1,000 demons. I didn't have the acting skills to pull that off. She commanded again. "By the blood of Jesus Christ, I demand, you tell me your name, demon." Another name popped into my head. I thought I'd read it somewhere, or maybe I finally was hearing God's voice. Cephas? Once she had a name, she was off to the races. She was yelling, commanding the demon to leave. She even asked follow-up questions. "How many are you? Where did you come from? Who is your master?" I sat still, trying not to laugh. Master? Me, apparently. I was out of believable answers. I considered making up a number for how many demons were stowing away in me. Would 7 be too many? 3? Suddenly, I was standing outside my body, watching a middle-aged woman yell at a demon inside a 21-year-old girl on a couch in a basement. Meanwhile, the 21-year-old girl, who knew she had no demon inside of her, was asking herself how many made-up demons was a reasonable amount to feign. The exorcist was still posing questions and yelling when I finally interrupted. "Sorry, I don't think anything is happening. I'm not even sure that was really what I heard. I don't think I'm going to hear anything. Maybe there's just no demon inside of me." She explained that there was definitely a demon present. I was certain there wasn't. I knew it deep down, like the way you know the curves in the road late at night when you're close to home. Then, the woman told me she needed to bring in the big gun, her husband, as soon as he was available. I was instructed to find her, first thing on Monday, to reschedule with Dion. She stood up to leave. I wiped the holy oil off my forehead with my sleeve. Just as quickly as it started, it was over. We would reschedule, and I was certain I wouldn't show up. Most people may not realize that the original Exorcist movie was based on a true story. The man it was inspired by died 3 years ago. After he died, his companion told the New York Post that the man never actually believed that he was the victim of satanic possession and later shunned religion. I don't know what that man experienced. I know I spent many years allowing people to tell me who I was until the stakes were so high that I was deciding how many made-up demons were inside of me. It forced me to wonder if there was a world where I could believe more in myself. Ultimately, I never did hear the voice of God or witness the dead rising back to life. It required a few more years for me to separate myself from the world of missionaries and evangelical rebels. As it turns out, it takes a while to dig out the ideas that are buried deep in you. That night, a piece of my faith dislodged, and I could no longer ignore it. I did not believe what they did. I was not one of them. If the exorcism was truly about liberation, it worked. John was an only child and not very good at making friends, so he found kinship with the adults in his life, but none were any closer than his aunt, who we'll call Tilly. Tilly was a spiritual woman and introduced John to objects and concepts related to the occult, including Ouija boards, which they played together. Aunt Tilly died at the age of 54, and it was shortly thereafter that John started exhibiting strange behaviors. According to one of the priests who later performed the exorcism, when it was asked if the spirit possessing John could knock 3 times if it was Aunt Tilly, 3 ominous knocks were heard by everyone in the room. John's family told the priests that ever since Aunt Tilly had died, objects near John would levitate and often violently fly across the room and break. It got so bad that John had to be removed from school as his desk would shake so badly it disturbed everyone around him. After things became too much for John's family to maintain, spiritual help was called in. When a priest first met with John, he suddenly burst out screaming, and as far as anyone knew, the 13-year-old boy spoke no Latin whatsoever. While it is possible he picked up on some Latin from attending church for most of his life, his family believed the devil was truly speaking through him. An attempt was made to exorcise a demon from John's body twice over a period of several months. The first attempt allegedly ended in minor bloodshed. Initially, John was brought to the home of his local pastor, and it was there that the boy was tied by his arms and legs to a bed, much like Regan MacNeil is in The Exorcist. In the middle of the stress and chaos of the rite, John managed to reach beneath the mattress and tear a metal spring from underneath it, which he then used to slash the pastor's arm. The gash was deep enough that it needed several stitches, and the exorcism was temporarily put on hold while the priests regrouped. While there's no physical evidence of this occurring, many people believe it did happen, and it managed to make enough of an impression on Blatty's imagination that he included it in his fictional interpretation of the events years later. From the very beginning, one of the more alarming aspects of John's alleged possession was the repeated occurrence of mysterious scratches spontaneously appearing on his body. As the story goes, one of these scratches formed actual words on his chest that read, St. Louis. John's parents took this as a direct sign and packed up the whole family on the first train over to St. Louis, Missouri. There, the desperate family met a reverend named William S. Bowden, and it was this man of God, a complete stranger to the family, who witnessed Poland's disturbing behavior for himself. The reverend ended up performing an intense marathon of between 20 and 30 rites of exorcism on the boy over the course of 2 months. It was during one of these sessions that even more words started appearing scratched into John's ravaged body, including the words hell and evil. It was after this that things turned violent with John, now violently resisting, convulsing, hissing in a disturbing voice, and even eventually breaking the nose of one of Bowden's assistants as they tried to restrain him. Despite all this, the struggle eventually paid off, and John was seemingly cured of whatever affliction was tormenting him. Whether it was the devil, the spirit of his occult-obsessed relative, or something else, John was back to normal and able to return to his life with his identity secured. Little would he know that the events that transpired around and within him in 1949 would have larger cultural ramifications just a few decades later. Years after the fact, after The Exorcist had come out and inspired untold hundreds of copycat exorcisms and alleged supernatural phenomena, writer Mark Opsasnik attempted to find a clear consensus of what actually happened with John Porter. The answers today are as vague as they were back then. An attempt by Opsasnik was made to reach out to John as an adult to get the final word on the story from the very subject himself, but it turned out to be a fruitless endeavor. John was still alive. He had seen The Exorcist, but he had no interest in recounting the events of what happened to him in 1949. Opsasnik believes John was never really possessed, and that the various accounts, recordings, and viewpoints on the matter are all manipulations of the truth by the different witnesses involved to suit their own needs. He wrote, quote, "To psychiatrists, John Porter suffered from mental illness. To priests, this was a case of demonic possession. To writers and film and video producers, this was a great story to exploit for profit. Those involved saw what they were trained to see. Everyone involved, even those with godly intentions, were ultimately seeing things through their own perspective. No one really had an objective viewpoint on what really happened. And as such, this story may forever remain just an urban myth that inspired even more horrifying stories decades later." Despite the cases of apparent legitimate demonic possessions, exorcisms are still only considered a truly last-ditch effort by the Catholic Church when all other methods, scientific and natural, have failed. In John's case, they apparently saw no other recourse to explain the strange phenomena that were associated with him, which is how he ended up having the rites performed. However, the Church still maintains that most cases of demonic possession are really nothing so fantastic. They suggest the true causes of these phenomena are likely to be more mundane, such as a deterioration of mental health and exposure to sinful stimulations, and that a person more likely needs to see a doctor or a therapist to help with whatever condition is ailing them. Beyond that, simple spiritual counseling may suffice, as opposed to a full-on exorcism. For John, it's entirely possible he was just acting out. He may have just been a lonely kid acting out after the death of his beloved aunt and friend. Since we only have the testimony of those involved to go on, it's very possible we haven't gotten the whole truth and never will. The events that happened transpired so long ago, and with most of those involved surely dead, we will probably never get a straight answer on what really happened. What we can surmise happened is something truly disturbed this boy, and whatever was going on with him was enough to disturb his family and local pastor so badly that they were driven to take drastic action. Something did happen to John, something that terrified the senses of those around him. It was enough that his terror reached the rest of the world and filtered through the imagination of writers and filmmakers. Now, whatever haunted John haunts us. Was it a demon, a ghost? Probably not, but it could have been something much more elemental that's disturbed the sensibilities of people for generations, that our children, no matter how well we raise them and how much we love them, can still have something inside of them we can't explain, something that scares us, something that could even hurt us worse than the devil himself, John. A small group of nuns and priests met the woman in the chapel of a house one June evening. Though it was warm outside, a palpable chill settled over the room. As the priest began to pray, the woman slipped into a trance and then snapped to life. She spoke in multiple voices. One was deep, guttural and masculine. Another was high-pitched. A third spouted only Latin. When someone secretly sprinkled ordinary water on her, she didn't react. But when holy water was used, she screamed in pain. "Leave her alone, you fucking priests," the guttural voice shouted. "Stop, you whores, you'll be sorry." You've probably seen this before. A soul corrupted by Satan, a priest waving a crucifix at a snarling woman. Movies and books have mimicked exorcisms so often they've become cliches. But this was an actual exorcism, and included a character not normally seen in the traditional drive out the devil script. Dr. Richard Gallagher is an Ivy League-educated, board-certified psychiatrist who teaches at Columbia University and New York Medical College. He was part of the team that tried to help the woman. Fighting Satan's minions wasn't part of Gallagher's career plan while he was studying medicine at Yale. He knew about biblical accounts of demonic possession, but thought they were an ancient culture's attempt to grapple with mental disorders like epilepsy. He proudly calls himself a man of science. Yet today, Gallagher has become something else, the go-to guy for a sprawling network of exorcists in the United States. He says demonic possession is real. He's seen the evidence, victims suddenly speaking perfect Latin, sacred objects flying off shelves, people displaying hidden knowledge or secrets about people that they could not have possibly have known. There was one woman who was like 90 pounds soaking wet. She threw a Lutheran deacon who was about 200 pounds across the room, he says. That's not psychiatry, that's beyond psychiatry. Gallagher calls himself a consultant on demonic possessions. For the past 25 years, he has helped clergy distinguish between mental illness and what he calls the real thing. He estimates that he's seen more cases of possession than any other physician in the world. Whenever I need help, I call on him, says the Reverend Gary Thomas, one of the most famous exorcists in the United States. The movie The Rite was based on Thomas's work. He's so respected in the field, Thomas says. He's not like most therapists who are either atheists or agnostics. Gallagher is a big man, 6'5", who once played semi-pro basketball in Europe. He has a gruff, no-nonsense demeanor. When he talks about possession, it sounds as if he's describing the growth of algae. His tone is dry, clinical, matter-of-fact. Possession, he says, is rare but real. I spend more time convincing people that they're not possessed than they are, he wrote in an essay for the Washington Post. Some critics, though, say Gallagher has become possessed by his own delusions. They say all he's witnessed are cheap parlor tricks by people who might need therapy, but certainly not exorcism. And, they argue, there's no empirical evidence that proves possession is real. Still, one of the biggest mysteries about Gallagher's work isn't what he's seen, it's how he's evolved. How does a man of science get pulled into the world of demonic possession? His short answer: he met a queen of Satan. She was a middle-aged woman who wore flowing dark clothes and black eyeshadow. She could be charming and engaging. She was also part of a satanic cult. She called herself the queen of the cult, but Gallagher would refer to her as Julia, the pseudonym he gave her. The woman had approached her local priest, convinced she was being attacked by a demon. The priest referred her to an exorcist who reached out to Gallagher for a mental health evaluation. Why, though, would a devil worshipper want to be free of the devil? She was conflicted, Gallagher says. There was a part of her that wanted to be relieved of the possession. She ended up relieving Gallagher of his doubts. It was one of the first cases he took, and it changed him. Gallagher helped assemble an exorcism team that met Julia in the chapel of a house. Objects would fly off shelves around her. She somehow knew personal details about Gallagher's life. How his mother had died of ovarian cancer. The fact that 2 cats in his house went berserk, fighting each other the night before one of her sessions. Julia found a way to reach him, even when she wasn't with him, he says. He was talking on the phone with Julia's priest one night, he says, when both men heard one of the demonic voices that came from Julia during her trances. Even though she was nowhere near a phone and thousands of miles away, he says he was never afraid. It's creepy, he says, but I believe I'm on the winning side. He also insists that he's on the side of science. He says he's a stickler for the scientific method, that it teaches people to follow the facts wherever they may lead. Growing up in a large Irish Catholic family in Long Island, he didn't think much about stories of possession. But when he kept seeing cases like Julia's as a professional, he says his views had to evolve. I don't believe in this stuff because I'm Catholic, he says. I try to follow the evidence. Being Catholic, though, may help. Gallagher grew up in a home where faith was taken seriously. His younger brother, Mark, says Gallagher was an academic prodigy with a photographic memory who wanted to use his faith to help people. We had a sensational childhood, Mark Gallagher says. My mother and father were great about always helping neighbors or relatives out. Their mother was a homemaker. and their father was a lawyer who'd fought in World War II. My father used to walk us proudly into church. He taught us to give back. Gallagher's two ways of giving back, helping the mentally ill as well as the possessed, may seem at odds, but not necessarily for those in the Catholic Church. Contemporary Catholicism doesn't see faith and science as contradictory. Its leaders insist that possession, miracles, and angels exist. But global warming is real, so is evolution, and miracles must be documented with scientific rigor. One of Gallagher's favorite sources of inspiration is Pope John Paul II's encyclical Fides et Ratio, on faith and reason. The Pope writes that there can never be a true divergence between faith and reason, since the same God who reveals the mysteries and bestows the gift of faith has also placed in the human spirit the light of reason. The Church's emphasis on faith and reason can even be seen in the birth of its exorcism ritual. The rite of exorcism was first published in 1614 by Pope Paul V to quell a trend of lay people and priests hastily performing exorcisms on people they presumed were possessed, such as victims of the bubonic plague, says the Rev. Mike Driscoll, author of Demons, Deliverance, Discernment, Separating Fact from Fiction About the Spirit World. A line in the rite said that the exorcist should be careful to distinguish between demon possession and melancholy, which was a catch-all for mental illness, Driscoll says. The Church knew back then that there were mental problems. It said the exorcist should not have anything to do with medicine. Leave that to the doctors. Doctors, perhaps, like Gallagher. Gallagher says the concept of possession by spirit isn't limited to Catholicism. Muslim, Jewish, and other Christian traditions regard possession by spirits, holy or benign, as possible. This is not quite as esoteric as some people make it out to be, Gallagher says. I know quite a few psychiatrists and mental health professionals who believe in this stuff. Dr. Mark Albanese is among them. A friend of Gallagher's, Albanese studied medicine at Cornell and has been practicing psychiatry for decades. In a letter to the New Oxford Review, a Catholic magazine, he defended Gallagher's belief in possession. He also says there is a growing belief among health professionals that a patient's spiritual dimension should be accounted for in treatment, whether their provider agrees with those beliefs or not. Some psychiatrists have even talked of adding a trance and possession disorder diagnosis to the DSM, the premier diagnostic manual of disorders used by mental health professionals in the US. There's still so much about the human mind that psychiatrists don't know, Albanese says. Doctors used to be widely skeptical of people who claim to suffer from multiple personalities, but now it's a legitimate disorder, dissociative identity disorder. Many are still dumbfounded by the power of placebos, a harmless pill or medical procedure that produces healing in some cases. There's a certain openness to experiences that are happening that are beyond what we can explain by MRI scans, neurobiology, or even psychological theories, Albanese says. Dr. Jeffrey Lieberman, a psychiatrist who specializes in schizophrenia, arrived at a similar conclusion after he had an unnerving experience with a patient. Lieberman was asked to examine the videotape of an exorcism that he subsequently dismissed as unconvincing. Then he met a woman who, he said, freaked me out. Lieberman, director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute, says he and a family therapist were asked to examine a young woman who some thought was possessed. He and his colleague tried to treat the woman for several months, but gave up because they had no success. Something happened during the treatment, though, that he still can't explain. After sessions with the woman, he says, he'd go home in the evenings and the lights in his house would go off by themselves. Photographs and artwork would fall or slide off shelves, and he'd experience a piercing headache. When he mentioned this to his colleague one day, her response stunned him. She'd been having the exact same experiences. I had to sort of admit that I didn't really know what was going on, Lieberman says. Because of the bizarre things that occurred, I wouldn't say that demonic possession is impossible or categorically rule it out, although I have very limited empirical evidence to verify its existence. If you want to know why so many scientists and doctors like Lieberman are cautious about legitimizing demonic possession, consider one name, Anneliese Michel. Michel was a victim in one of the most notorious cases of contemporary exorcism. If you have the stomach for it, go online and listen to audio tapes and watch videos of her exorcisms. The images and sounds will burn themselves into your brain. It sounds like somebody dropped a microphone into hell. Michael was a German Catholic woman who died of starvation in 1976 after 67 exorcisms over a period of 9 months. She was diagnosed with epilepsy but believed she was possessed. So did her devout Roman Catholic parents. She reportedly displayed some of the classic signs of possession: abnormal strength, aversion to sacred objects, speaking different languages. But authorities later determined that it was Michel's parents and 2 priests who were responsible for her death. German authorities put them on trial for murder, and they were found guilty of negligent homicide. The 2005 film The Exorcism of Emily Rose was based on Michel's ordeal and the subsequent trial. One of the leading skeptics of exorcism, and one of Gallagher's chief critics, is Stephen Novella, a neurologist and professor at Yale School of Medicine. He wrote a lengthy blog post dissecting Gallagher's experience with Julia, the satanic priestess. It could be read as a takedown of exorcisms everywhere. He says Julia probably performed a cold reading on Gallagher. It's an old trick of fortune tellers and mediums in which they use vague, probing statements to make canny guesses about someone. Fortune teller: I see a recent tragedy in your family. Client: You mean my sister who got hurt in a car accident? How did you know? Or take the case of a person speaking an unfamiliar language like Latin during a possession. A patient might memorize Latin phrases to throw out during one of their possessions, Novella wrote. Were they having a conversation in Latin? Did they understand Latin spoken to them, or did they just speak Latin? Novella says it's noteworthy that no one has filmed any paranormal event such as levitation or sacred objects flying across the room during an exorcism. He's seen exorcism tapes posted online and in documentaries, and says they're not scary. They're boring, he says. Nothing exciting happens. The most you get is some really bad play acting by the person who is being exorcised. In an interview, Novella went further and criticized any therapist who believes his patient's delusions. The worst thing you can do to a patient who is delusional is to confirm their delusions, says Novella, who founded the New England Skeptical Society. The primary goal of therapy is to reorient them to reality. Telling a patient who is struggling that maybe they're possessed by a demon is the worst thing you can do. It's only distracting them from addressing what the real problem is. Driscoll, the Catholic priest who wrote a book about possession, is not a skeptic like Novella. Still, he says, it's not unusual for people on drugs or during psychotic episodes to display abnormal strength. I have seen it take 4 grown guys to hold one small woman down, says Driscoll, a chaplain at St. Elizabeth Medical Center in Ottawa, Illinois. When a person has no fear and is not in their right mind, and they don't care about hurting themselves or hurting others, you can see heartbreaking things. That doesn't mean he thinks possession isn't real. He says the New Testament is full of accounts of Jesus confronting demons. Do I still believe it happens? Yes, I do, he says. It happened then. I don't know why it would be totally eradicated now. Gallagher agrees and has answers for skeptics like Novella. He says demons won't submit to lab studies or allow themselves to be easily recorded by video equipment. They want to sow doubt, not confirm their existence, he says. Nor will the church compromise the privacy of a person suffering from possession just to provide film to skeptics. Gallagher says he sees his work with the possessed as an extension of his responsibilities as a doctor. In a passage from a book he is working on about demonic possession in America, he says that it is the duty of a physician to help people in great distress without concern whether they have debatable or controversial conditions. Gallagher isn't the first psychiatrist to feel such duty. Dr. M. Scott Peck, the late author of The Road Less Traveled, conducted 2 exorcisms himself, something Gallagher considers unwise and dangerous for any psychiatrist. I didn't go volunteering for this, he says. I went into this because different people over the last few decades realized that I was open to this sort of thing. The referrals are almost invariably from priests. It's not like someone is walking into my office and I say, "You must be possessed." He may not have asked to join the hidden world of exorcism, but he is an integral part of that community today. He's been featured in stories and documentaries about exorcism and is on the governing board of the Rome-based International Association of Exorcists. It's deepened my faith, he says, of the exorcisms he's witnessed. It didn't radically change it, but it validated my faith. He says he's received thanks from many people he's helped over the years. Some wept, grateful to him for not dismissing them as delusional. As for letting a journalist talk to any of these people, Gallagher says he zealously guards their privacy. Julia, though, gave him permission to tell her story, but it didn't have a happy ending. He and a team of exorcists continued to see her, but eventually she called a halt to the sessions. She was too ambivalent. She relished some of the abilities she displayed during her trances. She was playing both sides. Exorcism is not some kind of magical incantation, Gallagher says. Normally, a person has to make their own sincere spiritual efforts too. About a year after she dropped out, Gallagher says he heard Julia's voice on the phone again. This time, she had called to tell him she was dying of cancer. Gallagher says he offered to try to help her with a team of priests while she was still physically able, but her response was terse. Well, I'll give it some thought. He says he never heard from her again. Inevitably, there will be others. His phone will ring. A priest will tell him a story. A team of clergy and nuns will be summoned, and the man of science will enter the hidden world of exorcism again. The critics, the souls that aren't saved, the creepy encounters, they don't seem to deter him. Truly informed exorcists don't tend to get discouraged, he says, because they know it is our Lord who delivers the person, not themselves. Is Gallagher doing God's work, or does he need deliverance from his own delusions? Perhaps only God and Satan knows for sure. Thank you for dropping by the archives and listening to our ghastly stories. Don't forget to like, comment, and lastly subscribe. Until next time, archivists, I bid you all good night.